Well, hello, and thank you for joining me today. I've got a very special conversation for you about the topic of whether we should be eating beef, whether it's good for you, and whether it's good for the environment. And so I've got a very special guest here, Nicolette Hahn Niman, who has authored a few books on this topic, and we're going to dive into the broader aspects of how beef and cattle are connected to humanity, and what are some of these counterpoints to whether we should be stripping beef and animal products from our diets and our lives in general. Nicolette, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I wanted to dive back, for those that aren't familiar with your work, into how you first began to getting into this whole area of talking about beef farming and so forth. Like, what was your step in?
Yeah, well, I have kind of an unusual background. I was a biology major in college, so I had a scientific training, and then I went to law school. I became a lawyer. I was a prosecuting attorney first, and then I worked for a law firm. And then I started working for environmental nonprofit organizations, and especially on water pollution. And I was working for an organization in the US called National Wildlife Federation, which is a big national nonprofit organization. And I happened to see a speech by Bobby Kennedy Jr., and I talked to him afterwards about his work and my work, and he told me he had an opening in his organization, and I applied for it and I was hired. And basically his organization is focused on water pollution, but he wanted me to focus specifically on the question of pollution from the livestock industry, and particularly concentrated livestock industry. So I started I was a little bit hesitant at first because it was a topic that didn't seem very appealing to me. It was all about manure, basically. So it wasn't very, glamorous. But I realized, I went and visited communities in a few different parts of the United States, in Missouri and North Carolina and a couple of other areas. And I realized that there were large concentrated livestock operations that were having huge impact on people's lives and on animals and on the environment. And there wasn't really anything being done about that. So I started the project for Bobby Kennedy. I was kind of working on it full time, trying to address the pollution that was coming from those large concentrated operations. And what I realized very soon into the project was that there was an incredibly big difference between, sort of good livestock production and industrial livestock operations. And I wanted to highlight that in our work. So I went from, the beginning of the project, we were sort of attacking the meat industry, but fairly soon after, within a couple of months, we started very consciously partnering with well-raised animal farmers and ranchers. And so we were especially working with the Niman Ranch Network, which is a network of about 800 farmers and ranchers that are all using traditional practices. And the founder of that group is someone named Bill Niman, and I ended up marrying him. So then I that's where my story takes a really unconventional turn. I had been a vegetarian myself for a long time already at that point, and I became I married Bill and was then a vegetarian married to a cattle rancher and meat industry CEO. So it was a very unusual partnership. But the really interesting twist was when I moved from New York to California and I started living on our ranch. I actually started working on our ranch, just a little bit here and there, a few hours here and there initially. And then I was enjoying it so much that I started pretty much doing it full time. I ended up not applying for lawyering positions in this area. And then I started to realize I really enjoyed what I was doing and felt really comfortable working on the ranch and working as essentially a ranch hand. I never would call myself the ranch manager. I never quite reached that level of expertise, but I did a lot of work on the ranch every day. And so, and then I wrote an initial book called Righteous Pork Chop, which was about basically a critique of the industrial way of raising animals. And after I wrote that book, I kept getting feedback from people saying things like, "Oh, I read your book and I became a vegetarian." And I thought, "Oh, geez, that was really not the message of it." Because I tried so hard in the book to, encourage people to seek out well-raised animal products and support good farming and ranching through their purchases and through policy and et cetera. But so I wrote the second book, Defending Beef, because I wanted to make the argument for good meat and good livestock farming. So now I've been living here for almost 18 years on our ranch. This is my kitchen that you're seeing in the background. We live in Northern California. We have a totally grass-based ranch here where we raise cattle and heritage turkeys. And we provide meat mostly to our local community and a lot of restaurants and individuals and some small retailers that buy from us. And I've, sort of become my primary mission, as I see it now, is to make the case that well-raised animals are really important ecologically and nutritionally as well. And I can tell you more about my own personal journey if you want me to talk about that. But I began eating meat again after 33 years as a vegetarian about 2 years ago. So that's an interesting part of the story too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I did want to touch on, because there is kind of a personal, swing to this where people are, have a little bit of their own connection to whether they're eating beef or not, or meat in general, and then the broader environmental question, which you do cover really well in your book. So I thought, why don't we go into that? Why don't we go into your personal journey from being a long-term vegetarian, weren't you, to starting to eat meat again? What was that like for you, and what made you make the decision?
Well, I can say that one of the important things is that all the work I was doing on meat and trying to really understand its environmental implications and also its nutritional issues, both good and bad. How does it affect the health in a negative way? How does it affect in a positive way? My sort of overriding conclusion from all the reading I did and just what I saw around me and in my own life was that the foods from animals were actually really important for human nutrition and health. And it was why I never became a vegan myself, because I really felt like at least I would have eggs and dairy. And I actually wrote in my books that I felt that a nutritionally optimal diet would include meat, but I was making a decision based on other considerations that I thought were, legitimate issues with respect to not wanting to take animals' lives for my food. But what happened was, the more I learned and the more I thought about it, I realized that, first of all, there's death in all food production, whether it's, plant or animal or fungi. And that what I was increasingly persuaded of is that, first of all, good health, really vibrant, optimal health, requires the nutritionally richest food that you can get. And probably for my own personal journey, the big change was when I turned 50 a few years ago. I decided, I really want to be, I've always been a triathlete. I mean, I was a triathlete for many years, I should say. And I was a runner for many, many years. I still am. And biker and swim, everything. I have 2 young boys, so I do a lot of, soccer and baseball and stuff with them. I'm just very physically active. But I also have always really tried to eat really healthy food that's really, nutrient rich and supports health. And I try to avoid processed foods, and I've tried to do that for a long time. But when I reached the age of 50, I started to realize that, a very typical pattern at that point in life is to begin to degenerate and that I didn't want to do that. So I just felt like I wanted to up my, the value of what I was eating, and that by adding meat back into my diet, I would be adding something really valuable in keeping myself healthy and staying, healthy, really healthy, not just like limping into my, older years, but really, running into my older years and jumping. And so I decided to add meat. And the interesting part for me was that when I started to eat meat again, I began by eating some beef from our own ranch. That was the first meat I ate after 33 and a half years of not eating meat. And I had this interesting sensation where I thought, well, when I literally bit into a hamburger that my husband had grilled for me on the grill, and I thought, am I going to feel this weird sense of remorse? And it was kind of the opposite. It was more like relief, because I realized I had been intellectually, I had felt for a long time like if I were eating meat, that would be better for me and my health. And I wasn't doing it. And so when I ate meat again, it was actually a kind of like, okay, I'm reclaiming my own capacity to keep myself really healthy going forward, and today and going forward. And so that was a couple years ago, and I've just felt really good. I haven't had any physical problems from starting to eat meat again, and I feel like I'm I didn't have any real health problems when I started eating meat again. A lot of people have those kind of dramatic stories. I don't have that, but I was beginning to see bone density loss. I had my bone density tested, and I found that out. And like a lot of vegetarians, I had that sensation of being hungry all the time, and that has completely gone away. I also feel that I haven't had my bone density retested, but that's part of my plan to do that. I just feel I do a lot of exercise, as I mentioned. I have, sort of anecdotally, I haven't measured it, but I feel that I'm better able to build muscle mass now that I'm eating meat. So that all makes me feel good, and I have a lot of energy, and I just feel good. I'm very glad I'm eating meat again.
Where was your original decision sourced on? Like what made you become a vegetarian at the start, and how did that influence your journey?
Yeah. So I talk about that in the book. I was a really environmentally minded kid. I was already, I would spend a lot of time outside, and I had little, kid magazines for environmentalists, as a kid. And I went to college and majored in biology, as I mentioned. And I got involved in our, environmental group at the college. And it was just kind of an idea that was really out there, in the same way that nowadays people talk about climate change. And if you're concerned about climate, you shouldn't eat beef. In that era, in the sort of early 90s, people were really, in late 1980s, people were really focusing on deforestation in the Amazon in particular. And so it was really this idea that if you cared about the Amazon and you didn't want, to lose the Amazon, then you shouldn't be eating beef. And I remember that I gave up beef first. I gave up all meat eventually, but the first thing I did was give up beef, because it just was like kind of reinforced in my mind over and over again that was the most problematic meat. And so it was primarily motivated by environmental concerns, but I also had, of course, been exposed to years of this idea that it was bad for you to eat saturated fat. And it just seemed, as well, there was that argument about it being sort of too consumptive, that it was something that just took up too much resources. And so you shouldn't be eating it if you're a good global citizen. And so I kind of bought into all of those ideas, and then just, stopped eating beef, and then stopped eating, just kind of gradually within a few months, I became a full vegetarian, and I did that for 33 years.
And this is quite early, kind of in the movement of vegetarian, and more recently there's been a movement to veganism. How have you seen that discussion develop, and what's your take on that in terms of some of the reasons behind why that has developed? Has it been an environmental push? You write about this a little bit in your book, but what's your take on it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting question, because there's a huge amount of discussion now about the environmental impacts of animal products, and especially beef, but really all meat, and even dairy and eggs. But what my research shows, and just what I also witnessed myself in the last few decades, was that there was a very conscious decision by animal rights activists to shift into that message. I actually saw there was kind of this meat is murder message that was out there in the 70s and 80s, and it had very limited appeal. There were obviously people that bought into that, and especially younger people often would, high school and college age people would, I would almost be kind of in that wave myself from when I stopped eating meat. but that was a message that was really popular when I was in college, and it just didn't really go very far. There was never, in the U.S. and other westernized countries, there was never more than about 3% of the population that identified as vegetarian. But about 15 years ago or so, maybe 20 years ago, there began to be a very conscious coupling of the climate change message and the anti-meat message. And I even uncovered in my research a lecture that was done at Harvard University by the author Jeremy Rifkin, who wrote the book Beyond Meat. And he was married to a vegan for a long time. I'm not sure if he's a vegan himself now. He was not a vegan himself, but he was married to a vegan. I think he now is a vegan as well. But in any event, he wrote this book that was very, very negative about beef, and I read it, and even at the time, as a vegetarian, I found it kind of a ridiculous, hyperbolic, overblown, not very in-depth understanding of agricultural systems and food systems. But in any event, he became kind of famous for his anti-beef work. And he gave this lecture at Harvard Law School, an animal rights conference that they had, where he actually said this exact thing. He said, you've had this meat is murder message out there for a long time, and it hasn't really worked. What we need to do is shift the message, and we need to focus on environmental impacts and especially the climate impacts. So it was super interesting to me that, he's certainly wasn't the only person that was coming up with this idea, but just that was very explicitly being decided, within the animal rights community, that we're going to shift our message towards using climate change as a way to get people to stop eating meat. And that has really expanded over the last decade or so, I would say. And now I think it's almost kind of the primary argument against meat. And I encounter people, almost every day that say that they don't eat meat, or they've dramatically reduced their meat because of climate change concerns. So the book, my Defending Beef book, is really squarely refuting that whole line of thinking.
Yeah, and I really want to dive into that, because it's an argument that's really endemic across society now. And when you wrote that point, it made me think that how we got here really being centered around basing around an argument, it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Because that argument to me really never made a lot of sense, and I didn't know the origins of it. So I was glad that you brought that up. And also too, that your own health journey, I see this a lot in patients that people reaching roughly the age of 50 or 60 or so, and they're starting to find these bone density scans. And really, I really try to instill the idea that we can have a measurable effect on our own health, and your skeletal health is incredibly important, incredibly connected to your teeth, and that making changes like you did is possible, and that it will have a measurable difference. I hope that you have a positive result on your next bone mass index. But this cross between this personal health and then broader environmental topics that you bring together in your book, I just think it's so important for people to see that there's a lot of different areas that you're arguing in here, and you're the right person to do it. But it really is a very complex issue that isn't boiled down to one point, that some people really do try to do, right? So I really want to jump into the idea that agriculture is pushing, or beef agriculture is pushing the process of climate change. And you break this down well in your book, but let's talk about that in terms of how that argument is brought about, and some of the numbers behind that.
Yeah, well, it really started, again, there are a couple of sort of key moments, I think, in the trajectory of the public conversation. And one of them was the 2006 report called Livestock's Long Shadow, which was written by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And I actually have met the lead author, and he's even visited our ranch. So I've had a chance to talk with him directly. And, it was a pretty good report in terms of, a lot of expertise went into it, and it really tried to analyze the emissions of the world and how much livestock contributed to that. But unfortunately, there was kind of a message behind the report. And the message was essentially we need to move towards a more intensified agricultural system. And the most efficient way to produce meat is actually in big concentrated industrial operations. So especially chicken and pork, versus, the sort of lower density, more external, systems that are outside, and basically the grazing animals. So it's ironic that particular report is being used by vegans so much, because it's the whole basis of the movie Cowspiracy, for example. Because actually what those reporters, what the authors were trying to argue for is greater intensification in the livestock industry. But the report was also kind of problematic. There was a press release that came out right with it that said the transportation industry actually produces fewer or less total emissions than the livestock industry. That turned out to be incorrect, and that was retracted by the authors, but that gets quoted all the time. And it also did a lot of things sort of logistically that I think are not correct. To sort of make the case that we have to really address this issue. They did, for example, they looked at deforestation in places like Brazil and like Sudan and Indonesia, and they attributed those emissions to the livestock sector, and then basically put that into the total. And then said, this is what beef causes. And that's really just so flawed. I mean, just from a logical standpoint, it makes no sense at all. So what you're doing is you're looking at, particular bad practices that are, that shouldn't be happening, and the environmental damage that's driving that. And then you're attributing that to the entire global sector. And that's just doesn't make any sense, because you have, beef production being done all around the world very differently and in very different situations, from an agricultural and an ecological perspective. And there's very good research, and I put this, a lot of this in the book, that shows that where you have well-managed beef, not only do you not have a massive, carbon emission problem, you actually, particularly well-managed beef, you'll actually get a carbon negative impact, because you will actually sequester more carbon in the soil than you will cause total climate change emissions in terms of both methane and any carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide emissions. When you add all that up together, you actually get so much carbon benefit to the soils that you'll actually offset that. So that just kind of shows the fallacy of generalizing and taking all of the negative emissions. And also, it's even more problematic because, as I go through in quite a bit of detail in the book, Brazil in particular, the deforestation situation, it's quite specific. And I've spoken directly with people that have lived and reported in Brazil, but also with people that are, Brazilians and are very involved in sort of public issues there. And everyone has explained to me the same thing, which is that the laws are such in Brazil that where you put cattle, you can claim ownership. So cattle are actually used as a way to get title to land. And ultimately that land is actually mostly going into soy production, which is the most profitable use of the land. And it doesn't even work very well for soy production because it doesn't have a deep enough topsoil, so it doesn't last. But that is the ultimate purpose, is to raise soy. So the cattle are continually looked at and, by activists, especially anti-meat activists, who say, well, this is all about creating beef. And the beef market is actually not driving this process at all. And what was explained to me by especially people that are from Brazil that I discussed this with, that there's a real desire to gain control over lands that have been held by indigenous peoples. And this is the way that a lot of large landholders do it. So the beef are almost being used in this, as a chess piece, like a pawn on a chessboard, to gain control. It has nothing to do with beef demand or supply. So, these are the kinds of things that there are just so many misconceptions and misinformation on this whole issue. And this is, one good example of that.
Absolutely. It's such a complex issue. And, reading your book, it really kind of reminded me that, that there is a lot here that we need to untie. One argument that does center quite front and center at the moment now is the idea of progressing climate change and the release of carbon into the atmosphere, and how cows and ruminant animals contribute to this. Can you talk to us about what is the rationale of this, of methane being released into the atmosphere, and what are some of the arguments for and against that?
Yeah. And in the US, we pronounce it methane. So I'm just going to say that right out because it's going to sound weird to your listeners, probably a lot of them, but I'm just going to call it methane because that's what we call it here in the US. But yeah, ruminant animals do produce methane. That is correct. And they produce it because they have very complex digestive processes. They have, 4-chambered, or it's multi-chambered, and in cattle, it's 4 chambers. And, it's a sort of an interesting issue. It's kind of a double-edged sword. It is the fact that they have this multi-chambered, very complex digestive process and digestive system is what enables them to survive on very low quality vegetation, sort of all around the world. They can actually eat what is essentially inedible to most other animals, including humans. And so that's kind of a miraculous thing that cattle can do this. They can convert vegetation that is just naturally occurring, rain fed and, powered by the sun and rain, and that's it. And the goats, the sheep, and the cattle come along and they just eat it. And that is something that they can actually live off of. And that's something humans can't do. And then because the animals, those ruminant animals can do that, we can get meat and milk from that land that we could not otherwise use for crop production. And without plowing, without irrigating, there is some plowing and some irrigation that happens in some systems, but you don't have to do that. And the vast majority of the grazing animals in the world are raised on that kind of land that isn't plowed, isn't planted, isn't irrigated, nothing is done to it, essentially. So that's an incredibly important part of the story that people need to understand. But because they're existing on this very low quality food source, essentially, very highly cellulosic plants, mainly grass. There are actually, there's a huge population of microorganisms that reside in this complex digestive tract that they have. And those organisms are breaking down this, sort of in symbiosis with the animals, are breaking down this vegetation and turning it into nourishment for the cattle and the sheep and the goats. And as they do that, just as if you had a swamp and you had deterioration of the vegetation, which happens all the time, swamps are actually one of the largest sources of methane in the world. And just like rice production is also one of the largest sources of methane in the world because there's a lot of moisture in it. And there's that degradation of the biomass that keeps occurring in rice fields. So that's why you get methane from those places. And you similarly get methane in the cattle digestive tract. And in fact, it might be helpful for people to know, termites have a very similar system. And they actually eat wood and break it down with the microorganisms in their guts in a similar way that cattle do. So they're like little tiny cows. I like people to think about that. And then you can understand how, a termite can eat wood, but we can't eat wood. Well, cattle can eat grass, but we can't eat grass. And it's because of the same system. So in that breaking down of the vegetation, they release methane, both through burping and farting, basically, but primarily through burping. It's sort of a process that they're continually releasing the gas as they're going through this long digestion. And the super interesting thing about this is that, the sort of environmental argument, the animal rights argument, is that because of that methane release, they cause a lot of climate change. But what I go through in a lot of detail in my book is explaining why that's not correct. And starting with the first point, which is that there's actually there are 2 totally different types of carbon. There's old carbon and there's new carbon. And this is explained really well by a number of people, but one of them is Dr. Frank Mitloehner, who's a professor at UC Davis here in California. And he's a professor of agriculture, but especially air emissions. It's kind of his specialty. And he talks about this whole notion of carbon that is continually cycling through the natural environment. And that is old carbon. That's carbon that's kind of always been there, and it's been there for eons, and it's still there. And then you have new carbon, which is the stuff that's being pulled out of the earth that was kind of deeply buried. And that's what fossil fuel production is all about. So whether it's oil or natural gas or coal, you have deeply buried carbon in those forms. And then it's being released to the environment when you have, for example, methane leaks. There's tons and tons of methane leaks all over the world that are causing methane emissions. And you just have a lot of emissions of carbon, CO2, as well as methane, in all of the extraction and the refining and the burning of fossil fuels. So you have lots of, and that's all new carbon, because that was carbon that was stored away and tucked away in the earth, deep in the earth, until it was extracted to use for fossil fuels. So there's this very important distinction. And then the next really important thing that people need to understand about methane and cattle is something that I learned from Dr. Miles Allen, who's a professor at Oxford University in England. And I read a bunch of his writings, and I saw him speak on YouTube. And then I met him in person in England in 2019. And he explains that, and he's a physicist and actually was on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Scientific Advisory Committee for several years. So he's extremely knowledgeable about this topic. He's one of the world's experts. And what he says is that there's something called global warming potential, GWP, which is used to measure, how much global warming something's causing, and, how much emissions and how much global warming potential it has. It's used all over the world by governments all over the world. But he says it's actually completely a wrong system when applied to methane, because you make carbon equivalents. Everything is about equivalent to CO2, and it doesn't really work when you're doing methane, because methane is so short-lived in the environment. And so what he says is that the cattle herd of the globe has kind of a historic load of methane that it has contributed over time, and that has actually been there forever, because we had wild ruminant animals before we had domesticated cattle. But that you would not be in any way contributing to global warming just by continuing the existence of those cattle, because there's continually a breaking down, about a 10-year half-life for methane emissions versus 100,000 years for carbon dioxide. So whereas you're continually adding warming when you release CO2, you're not doing that with methane. And so when cattle are releasing methane, they're actually just maintaining the current level of methane in the environment, which does not increase warming. So I go through this again. It's a very kind of technical stuff, but I go through it in a lot of detail in the book, and I give people resources where they can read more about it. But it just shows that the whole methane emission issue is being radically misunderstood. And I want to note too that when I talked to Dr. Allen, he specifically said that he was very frustrated by the attention that was being paid to cattle, because he said everybody knows that it's all about fossil fuels. So, it's really, this further strengthens my belief that this is an issue that has been almost manufactured by animal rights activists.
Well, there's been a recent push against meat and the push towards artificial production of grass-fed, of plant-based meats, and it seems to be all targeting beef. What's your thoughts on why there's such a targeted campaign against beef itself? And this is really getting quite, because there's policy now being put out where we're talking about reducing beef, in society and in people's consumption of it. Some of these arguments are based on climate, but why do you think we've moved so heavily towards beef? And then when we're starting to compare the alternatives, which are plant-based meats, can you give us a bit of a perspective on what the environmental impact of these kind of crops are?
Yeah. So I should note that I read your book, The Dental Diet, and loved it. And the thing that I really liked about it was how you emphasized just the importance of real food versus processed foods. And I think that is kind of where I keep coming down to as well. More and more in my life, I've, and I have 2 young children, and cooking every day for all of us. And I just really focus on this idea of trying to get to minimize as much as possible how much processed food we're consuming, and to have really nutrient-rich, nutrient-dense foods. And so, my primary concern about all this faux meat is really that it's just highly processed food. I don't actually think it's healthy food. And, I can, and I will in a moment say some words about the environmental impact, but the idea that this is something we should be eating to be healthier to me is laughable, because, you're taking a food like beef, any kind of meat, but especially beef. It's incredibly rich in so many vitamins. It's the absolute best form of protein that you can get. It's, because it's just really usable by the human body. And a lot of people know that about the protein in beef, but they don't realize that about the iron and the zinc and the calcium, and how many things you get from eating meat that you don't get from, meat substitutes. But so to me, it's really troubling that you're telling people that you're going to be healthier if you, avoid this real food and you substitute it with this very highly processed, essentially fake food, in my view. So on the environmental side, I think that's the other really interesting part about this. You have a lot of attention paid to the environmental implications of beef. And as I've, been talking about here, I think that a lot of that is really misattribution and misunderstanding and misinformation. But I also think that there's been very little attention paid to the truly staggering environmental cost of, sort of the monoculture, industrialized monoculture that is covering so much of the globe. And I quote in my book, I quote the American sociologist Jackson. I'm blanking on his first name for some strange reason, but Wendell Jackson. No, not Wendell Jackson. I'm sorry. His name is Jackson, and I know him well, but I'm just blanking on his name. In any event, his daughter's name is Laura. Sorry about this. Anyway, he's written a great book, The New Age of Agriculture, and it's all about how we basically destroyed the planet with the plow, and it's something people don't even think about when they're buying food. But the protective vegetative covering of the earth is essentially those grasses that we were talking about before, the sort of inedible grasses. And what has enabled humans to live, all over the earth is these grazing animals that have wandered with them to these vegetative covered areas. And this is a vegetated blanket that holds the soils in, and it also holds the water in. And it is what enables the life below ground, the subterranean environment, that is really the key to sequestering carbon in the soil from the sun and through photosynthesis. And when you plow the ground, which is what, sort of agriculture is all about, is you're just basically shredding that vegetative cover, and you're destroying that densely tangled network of roots below ground that hold the water there in the soil and hold, basically hold the carbon, create the opportunity for a lot of carbon sequestration. And so one of the main points I make in the Defending Beef book is that, crop production is very environmentally destructive. It can be done in better ways. There's the whole no-till movement, and organic agriculture is much better than conventional. But just as a general matter, the only way you can produce food without really disturbing that dense vegetative blanket over the earth is with grazing animals. So I think that sort of that whole story of monoculture crops, and especially done on a large industrial scale with chemicals, which is what is actually the ingredients in all of these faux meats, that's a big part of the story that people really don't understand at this point, or at least they're not really looking carefully at that. So, from an environmental standpoint, I do not believe there's even a way to make an alternative burger that is, environmentally better than a real beef burger, especially from a well-managed, ranch. But I also think of it as highly processed foods. That is exactly the opposite of what we should be eating if we want to be, really healthy and have good, healthy teeth, as you write about, and strong bones, and, just to help good, vibrant health over our lifetimes. So I have a real problem with the whole movement towards faux meat. I'm glad to see that. I think, you always have this burst of initial media coverage that's all very enthusiastic. And then you start to get some pieces of, investigative reporting kind of looking a little deeper. And I've seen quite a few of those into the faux meat in the last couple of years. And I'm glad to see that, because it was kind of a story that was only one sort of glowing side was being told, and it was not a very accurate picture. I think we're getting a fuller picture now.
And it was one that was kind of coupled with that environmental argument too. And it just doesn't make sense to me that you're going to be making these huge monocrops, and that this is a better way to to mitigate something that potentially isn't an issue as well. I love the description of having grazing animals, and taking them to environments where there is just grass, and the way they produce such a nutrient dense and life-giving relationship, which is what really grazing animals and the production of dairy and meats and so forth, the human relationship with our cattle has really been about. So it's crazy to me that this discussion has really gone towards a negative, but it really has been based on the conventional farming methods, hasn't it? And so I thought you could maybe just help us understand what are some of the downsides of conventional farming, because I think everyone knows that we can do better in that sense, and comparing that to regenerative methods.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important point. I think especially in this age where everybody gets their information in sound bites, there's been a kind of an argument that's been building for quite some time that, that meat is bad for the environment. But what I really think that's about, a lot of that is about basically large industrial factory farms are bad for the environment and produce, food that's not, absolutely not of the highest quality. I mean, you have all kinds of concerns about antibiotic resistance bacteria present in the meats, as well as drug residues. I go through a lot of that in my first book, Righteous Pork Chop, where I detail a lot of the problems with industrial style of animal production. And, whenever you have the concentrated, indoors animal production, so especially the pigs and the poultry, and then to some extent the dairy, you have a concentrated waste. You have huge amounts of manure. Often it's liquefied, depending on the species and depending on the type of operation. But, like egg laying operations generally liquefy the manure, and so do most dairies. But poultry operations do not do that. But in any event, you have concentrated huge amounts of manure, and then you have to dispose of that, and it sort of becomes, a large environmental problem. Whereas, in a traditional farm and in a well-managed regenerative operation, the manure from the animals is incredibly valuable. It's something that not only does it contain, a lot of people are aware that, animal manure and poultry litter contain nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and that sort of thing. But also, increasingly, I think it's being understood that the life of the soil, the biology of the subterranean environment, soil biology, is probably the single most important thing in regenerative agricultural systems. I've had some very interesting conversations with people in agriculture who told me that they were in agriculture for decades before they ever heard anyone speak of soil biology. It was always about soil chemistry. It was about the physical properties of soil, how much aggregation there is, how much, how dry it is, or whatever. But there wasn't any discussion about the life that's down there. And actually, that is the single most important thing, not just for safeguarding the natural resources like water and wildlife and so forth, but actually it has a huge impact on how much nutrition is contained in the food. So if you have vegetables or any kind of plants that you're raising for human food or for animal feed for that matter, and you're raising them in a soil that is essentially dead, and you're just adding chemicals to it to give it the nutrients that it needs, you're going to produce much lower quality food or feed. And that's going to have downstream effects. So again, going back to your book and the issues that you talk about in the dental diet and the work of Dr. Weston Price, there's more and more recognition that the food that we're eating now is of much lower nutritional value than the food that we ate, let's say, traditionally, certainly, and even in more recent memory. There have been some very interesting studies showing, the decline in quality of not just apples and, beets and everything like that, but also even pork. the vitamin B12 content is much lower now in in the modern confinement pig, for example. So so it has all kinds of implications when you do an industrial system. We thought actually one of the things I talk about that a lot of people told me they'd never heard before and talk about in Defending Beef is the fact that some of the soil biology research has uncovered the fact that there's this substance on the roots of the plants, the growing plant. It's called glomalin or glomalin, and that's an important coating that covers the roots, and it helps the transmission between the plant and the soil. The plant actually gives the soil carbon in exchange for the nutrients that it needs to grow. But what the research on this glomalin has also revealed is that where you put artificial commercial fertilizer on it, so going back to your question about industrial agriculture, where you do that, the plant will actually lose the ability to do this kind of transaction. And so it doesn't get all that nutrient that it needs from the soil in order to make a really nutritious food at the end. And so these are kind of the downstream effects of industrial agriculture that haven't really been understood until pretty recently. And the more obvious effect, of course, is huge amounts of water pollution. In the United States, we have, for example, the whole middle of the country, the soil, the commercial fertilizers draining into the river systems and going down into the Gulf of Mexico and creating a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, the size of the state of New Jersey. So, and that's all from commercial fertilizers and other chemicals that are being applied to crops like soy and corn. So this is what industrial agriculture looks like. And it's basically caused tremendous environmental damage, and it produces unhealthy food. And when you talk about regenerative systems, you're modeling it on nature, and you're trying to create something that's complex and diverse. And you try to have animals and plants and fungi all working together. And I didn't really understand the whole role of fungi until I wrote this book and did a lot of research on it. But especially in the below ground environment, the microscopic fungi are incredibly important. They're very deeply involved in those transactions I was just talking about between the plant and the soil. And they have many other roles that they play. So it's about supporting life in regenerative agriculture. It's about fostering life versus conventional agriculture, which is always about trying to focus on sort of inputs and outputs, and essentially trying to kill everything that isn't the exact thing that you're trying to produce. And my friend Gabe Brown, who's a very famous farmer in the US and lives in North Dakota and has written a great book called Dirt to Soil, he says that he used to, when he was a conventional farmer, he used to wake up every morning and think, what am I going to kill today? Which weed or which insect or whatever. And then when he started moving towards regenerative farming, it was all about, what kind of life am I going to be fostering today? And what am I going to see out there that's, blossoming or, that's coming to life now that wasn't here before, because he saw a dramatic transformation in the soil carbon content and in the insect life and in all kinds of animal and plant life on his farm. So when he, shifted from conventional to regenerative. So it's an interesting shift in mindset that the whole, agricultural community is starting to make. I'm happy to see it's, an awakening that I think is happening.
Obviously, there's the problem of feeding large populations and having enough produce to to travel all around America, for instance. How do you see this transition, and what are some of the steps that need to be made in terms of converting some of the conventional techniques into a more broad scale regenerative model?
Well, some people think everything has to be done in a really small scale and that there's no truly, regenerative agriculture unless it's kind of really small scale. And I don't really agree with that, because I think even though the most exciting models I've seen, like Gabe Brown's farm, for example, are smaller scale, I am really excited to see companies like General Mills and others that are embracing, in fact, they're working with Gabe Brown specifically, but they're trying to learn, how can we produce cereal crops and other things on a larger scale using truly regenerative techniques. And I think that's very exciting development, because we need to make a lot of change very quickly, and it isn't going to happen nearly fast enough, for the sake of the planet and for all of our health, if we don't have sort of major food production companies involved in this idea of embracing regenerative agriculture. So I think the key point is that soil biology is kind of where the rubber meets the road, and whether you're producing soy or wheat or pork or cattle, it's really about focusing for the first time on the health of the soil and the biology. There is a really interesting study that I cite in my book Defending Beef that showed that where you have the most diverse soil microorganisms, the highest population and the most diversity, you will actually have the most kind of upstream in the ecosystem, the most diversity. So if you have a really vibrant life down in the soil, and especially with a lot of diversity of types of organisms, you'll get a different diversity. You'll get more diversity in the plants that grow, in the insects that are in that environment, and then all of the animals of every size going up, all the way up to elephants. Basically, the more diversity you have in that soil, the more diversity you'll get, the more biodiversity in the whole ecosystem. And so I think we can see that kind of change happening. It can happen, and it's beginning to happen at all in all types of agriculture, whether it's crop production or animal farming. And I really think we need to basically move entirely away from the large scale confinement systems for animals. I think that they're not only, they're not good places for animals, they're not good places for humans that live there or work there. And they really don't produce the healthiest food, and they cause a lot of environmental problems. So I'd like to see, a pretty dramatic shift towards animals being raised in more natural environments, basically outdoors to the greatest extent possible, and on grass and on pasture and on rangelands, and basically see a movement away from chemicals and monocrop production in crop production. And it can happen, it's beginning to happen. I think the good news on the climate change front is that there's more and more recognition among sort of large players like in the food industry that, this is something real, this is something we need to address, and that we can do something quite different than what we're doing now. And there's even, I think, a recognition about this higher quality food that can be produced, and much better long-term sustainability of the land that they're using, which is important for, all of these companies being forward and going forward. And it's certainly important for us as humans that we are producing healthy food, and that we know that we can do that for generations to come.
Absolutely, which is such an important point. Nicolette, how can someone at home begin to contribute to this movement? How would you suggest that people, connect to, local farmers and so forth? How would you say that they should go about that?
Yeah, well, one thing I always try to tell people is don't get discouraged, because, they'll like read my book, or they'll listen to, a lecture that I gave or someone else that's working in regenerative agriculture gives, and they say, oh God, it's, just such an overwhelming problem. So they just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing now. So, I try to say, no, don't do that. Don't get discouraged. Just take baby steps. And I think, as you mentioned, one of the good steps is to begin looking for local farmers in your community that you can buy directly from. There are all kinds of ways of buying, shares of a farm's production, or to buy from a farm stand, or to go to farmers markets, or co-ops that, I don't know exactly what the term would be in Australia, but in the US, they're like co-op stores where you can go and buy a lot of what's just produced from local farms is a lot of what they carry. And I would just say, sort of begin questioning where you're getting your food from, and just begin to try kind of one step at a time to shift. And I often suggest specifically eggs, because eggs are something that's usually with a little bit of effort, you can find someone in your community that's raising pasture raised eggs. And there's a very dramatic difference with eggs, like the nutritional differences are really dramatic, a great deal more, vitamin E. They're really high in, when you compare pasture versus conventional, I'm talking about. And that's true of almost all of the nutrients that are contained in eggs, that there's a very dramatic difference. So it's kind of like worth the effort. And when you crack open a pasture raised egg, you can see the difference and you can taste the difference. So it's something that it's kind of fun to, find some really good eggs, look for them in your community. I happen to live in a town where we have a lot of people that have backyard chicken flocks. So even though we have a ranch ourselves, we don't raise hens, for eggs. And I get them from several local friends. And actually, we do a lot of bartering in our community with, we give them some of our meat and they give us some of their eggs or some of their vegetables, and which is kind of fun just to build those relationships with people that way. But I think just start with one thing, like your eggs as an example. And for me, it's like a journey. You're beginning the process of trying to get your food a different way than what you were doing before. It's a little bit more time intensive, but it's really satisfying because you're, it's kind of fun. I mean, it's really fun to go to a farm stand or a farm that you can buy directly from. And you build the relationship with the person who's actually providing you the food. So there's more depth to your food and your whole food experience. And even as you're eating it, the story behind your food. And I find that really satisfying. And we always talk about it amongst our family, where everything came from and, any stories we might have to share about that place or those people. And it's just a whole different experience than just going to a grocery store and buying everything you need on your list from A to Z. Not that you don't go to, I still go to grocery stores, but I get a lot less there than I, would have done 20 years ago.
Well, Nicolette, it's such an important and complex, issue that we're all living amongst. So I want to thank you so much for all the work you've done in helping us to understand better where our food comes from and how we can be better for the planet, and not only for ourselves today, but also the next generations. Where can people find the second edition of your book? It's out soon, isn't it? And tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me today. The book is coming out on July 20th, the new version of Defending Beef. It's a completely revised version, so even if someone has already read the original, they might want to check out the new one because there's a lot of new stuff in there. But it's it'll be on Amazon, and I hope it will be available in Australia. And I have a very active Facebook page, Defending Beef, and we have a Twitter account as well for at Defending Beef. And so if you're interested in these issues, you just follow what we're doing, and there's a lot there. I mean, we post stuff every day about agriculture and food and health and diet and how all this stuff is all related. And we actually have a huge number of followers within the agricultural world, including in Australia, on those accounts. So we have some very interesting discussions of people from around the world.
It's great to see the movement really growing, and that this conversation really is pushing towards, that we can make a difference. And that I want to thank you so much for that, Nicolette, and that I really think this is going to be an important conversation into the future. Thank you so much for spending the time with me.
My pleasure.